Welcome to today's Wednesday webinar. I'm Mila Tappan from the Finance Authority of Maine. I'm the manager of college access and outreach, and today we're going to talk about tips for a smooth transition to college. So welcome to all of you who are joining us. I'm so glad that you can be here today and that we can have this conversation about the next steps in the process. Everyone is on mute, so please do feel though that you can ask questions. So on the panel, please enter any questions that you do have. I will attempt to answer any questions during the session today while we're together. But if I'm not able to, or if something requires research, I will follow up in an email afterwards. So let's go ahead and get started. So one of the reasons that we started doing this session, we do it every other year typically, is because there's so much to do over the summer for students. And this session is going to focus primarily on, or I'm going to talk about it from the perspective of seniors in high school. But the reality is these are steps that virtually every student who's going on to college needs to take. So our adult students, students who are transferring even from one campus to another or one school to another. So even though I'm kind of sharing it from the perspective of a high school student, I hope that this is something that's going to be beneficial to all audiences. So the goal here today is to prevent summer melt. So if you're familiar with the concept of summer melt, it's the phenomenon where we lose about 20% of our students over the summer, meaning that we have students who have deposited, they've committed to a school, they're planning to go to the school, everyone's excited about it, but for a whole variety of reasons, over the course of the summer, something comes up, and inevitably 20% approximately of those students do not end up actually enrolling in the fall at the institution that they had selected. So we want to be sure that obviously here in Maine, we need all of our students going on to some sort of education beyond high school to get that training, and every student matters, and we don't want to lose any of them. So the intent of today is to share some of the things that do arise in the hope that knowing about them can be the first significant step to making sure that these are not barriers and that anything that's come up can be overcome. So where we are is we're actually kind of in early May, mid-May. Ideally, students have already done a lot. So ideally, they have maybe attended an admitted student day if possible. Certainly not a requirement, but just a nice thing if they're able to get more familiar with the school that they're planning to attend. They've sent in their admissions deposit. May 1 was that big day to commit to a school, and you basically are showing your commitment primarily by sending in some money. They have applied for campus housing if appropriate. Now, not all students are going to be living on campus, but if students are, they do need to go through that process to make sure that they have applied for housing and filled out associated paperwork. Hopefully by now they have registered for orientation. So we're going to talk in a moment more specifically about orientation, but virtually every school that I've checked into here in Maine, they allow a student to register for orientation ahead of time and want them to obviously. And usually they're doing that by going online and just submitting some information. We hope that all students have set up their email and confirmed their access to their online portal. In reality, I hope most of our students did this as soon as they were offered admission. So typically when a school offers admission, what they're going to do is provide the student with information on how to set up their school-specific email. So every school has their own email system for that school, for their students. And so they want students to set up an email account so that they can communicate with them electronically. Which can be a little overwhelming sometimes to students because maybe they've applied to 5 or 6 or even more different schools. So hopefully the students have set up those emails and are familiar with how to use the email system. And then the other big step is to be sure that they've confirmed access to the online portal. Virtually every school out there now has a portal, and there is so much information that resides in the portal. It's going to be everything from financial aid to the bill to the class schedule. All of that information can be found there. So if students have not yet found out how to access the portal, it's really, really, really critical that they be sure that they do that as soon as possible. And then also we hope by this point that students have, completed financial aid verification if they were selected. We know there are some students out there who are still trying to navigate the verification process. We find that there are a portion of students who do have to provide some additional documentation when they apply for financial aid. Does not mean that they did anything wrong. We always want to reassure them of that, but some additional pieces of information may be required. So if you have students that are still struggling with that process, first of all, let us know at FAME if we can do anything to help, but they do need to get that completed, because if they've been selected for verification, their award does not become finalized until they have completed the verification process. We have some students out there, I'm sure, also who have not applied for financial aid yet. I was looking at the statistics yesterday, and for our high school seniors, we hope that they will complete their FAFSA by May 1st. In part so they can be considered for the State of Maine grant, which the deadline was May 1st. But we're finding that at the moment we have a little less than 60% of students who have filed their FAFSA. So we know there's a bunch out there that still need to. So please encourage them to do so. It's not too late to file a FAFSA for the upcoming year. Definitely not too late. So please have students do that if they have not done that part. And then hopefully the vast majority of students we're hoping have applied, they've submitted any additional paperwork that they need for financial aid, and they have gotten that actual financial aid award, that official letter with all of the information about the financial aid that they have been offered. So that's hopefully stuff that's already been done and is in good shape. If not, then revisit some of these things and just make sure that students are on track to get these done as soon as possible. So what comes next? So the next things that we want students to do are the list here. So we're going to take a few moments and we're going to talk about each of these individually, and so that students kind of know what they need to do within each of these realms. So the first thing, and probably if I could say one of the absolute most important things for students to do, is to attend orientation. Now, maybe some students have already gone to that Accepted Students Day, which is great. But orientation itself is a critical thing for students to attend. It's going to be one of the best ways for them to get acquainted with the campus and what's coming next. Usually, orientations take place over the summer. I was looking at some dates here. I looked up a couple of schools, and Orono, for example, UMaine, their orientations are taking place depending on the college that the student is attending, within the University of Maine. They're taking place from June 24th through June 27th. Husson, it's June 24th through June 28th. USM works a little bit differently. I'll talk about that in a moment. UNE, again, June 26th through June 27th. So that seems to be a pretty popular period of time for orientation for summer. Thomas, it looks like it is June 14th. So if you have a student yourself or you're working with students, have them go to the go to the webpage for their school and learn more about orientation and be sure that they get registered for that. Some schools, it's just a one-day event. Some days it's a 2 or even 3-day event. It just depends. Every school is a little bit different. You're going to hear me say that a lot today. Sometimes schools have everyone come. Smaller schools might have everyone come at the same time. Others might divide that up by major. So for example, that's definitely how they do it at Orono. Depending on the college that you're in, you're going to be with people who are in that same college. Again, might be supplemented by some accepted student days or a welcome weekend. So sometimes what schools do is they will do some orientation maybe in the summer, but then for new incoming students, they will have something just prior to classes starting in late August or early September. So it's really great just to kind of know what the school plans to do so that students can be sure they can work their schedules to attend and participate in those activities as much as possible. Many of the schools, when they are having orientation, have these primary goals in mind. They are looking for students to become familiar with the campus. This might seem like a really basic thing, And depending on the campus, some students might be very familiar with the campus already, but I'm away at a conference today, and so hopefully no one's going to be knocking on my door. But you know, when I came into the hotel where I'm staying, I hadn't been here before, and just navigating that, figuring out where do I park my car, how do I actually get into the building. At one point it was raining. You know, where's the front desk? How do I get to my room? Where are the elevators? Really simple, basic things. But you know, I always feel a little bit better once I kind of know the answers to all of those questions. And within a day, certainly in this place, I felt very comfortable. But I think about that with students as well. It's really important that they know where they're going. And once they know where they're going physically, even, it's really going to set their mind at ease to a certain extent. And they can visualize it too. That's the other really big key. At orientation, they are also typically going to get to meet with their academic departments so that they can get, again, just familiar faces in some cases is going to be one of the most significant pieces of that. But also they're going to, in some cases, register for classes. So one of the schools that's doing things a little bit differently that I alluded to a moment ago is USM, for example. I was not able to find that they have an official orientation where they bring everyone together. Now, it could be that I just missed it, so I want to be clear about that. But what USM has done is they now have students meeting with their advisors for 90 minutes over the summer before they even start classes. And during this time, they're called ACS, Advising and Course Selection Sessions. Students need to go online. They go to Blackboard, which is a way, an online classroom, basically. Many schools have this, and USM does as well. And there are some things they need to do ahead of time. And so then they're going to basically be scheduling appointments with those advisors. And so in lieu of orientation, it looks like to me, that's what they will be doing. So it's going to be a great opportunity to get that academic counseling right from the very beginning. So again, every school is so different, so understanding the requirements at that individual school are important, but in some ways, schools are going to want to be sure that students are becoming connected with the academic side of the house, and orientation is a great way to do that. As far as registering for classes, sometimes what happens is schools will basically put students into classes and then provide them with their schedule. Sometimes what they will do is they will do it during orientation. Sometimes there'll be some conversations during orientation, but there'll be follow-up after orientation where they actually get registered. So just really important that the student understands for the school that they're attending, how is that done? And sometimes, oftentimes, especially for math, a placement test may need to be taken so that it can be determined what class the student should be in, so that when they register for classes, they know whether they need, you know, this math class or that math class. So the website's a great place to start for any of this specific information. The student obviously wants to be sure they have a place to live, and that's no easy feat in some cases. Many times students are going to be living on campus that first year, which is great. If they're able to do that, I think that does provide an experience that can be very beneficial, but it does require that the student make sure that they get all their paperwork in and secure their housing. So checking on that during orientation is important. They want to meet with financial aid in the business office, even if it's just to check in and make sure everything looks like it's on target. Putting names and faces together for me, I know, is always so important, and just, again, adds that ease as we're making transitions. Students can also get their student ID that day. Their student ID is going to basically be the key that unlocks all sorts of things, literally and figuratively, getting into the dorms, getting into the library, putting money on their cards so they can buy food. So getting that ID is critical. That usually happens at orientation. At orientation, they also want to be sure that they bring any necessary paperwork with them. So in getting ready for today, I went online, and there are several schools where they do have a list out there that says, when you come to orientation, here's what we want you to bring with you, and here's what we'd like you to do to prepare. So again, check those individual sites. A couple of ones that are very common for most schools is they want to be sure that students provide their immunization paperwork. So in order to, and again, we've got this measles epidemic going on, so this is probably heightened even more than it has been in the past, but typically students need to provide proof of immunization before starting classes. So if they want to get that taken care of as soon as possible, provide that paperwork if they've already had all of their shots. If they haven't, be sure what they need to get ahead of time. And I know in our case, because I've got 2 boys of college age, and it was just making sure that I could find the documentation, to be honest with you. So for the parents on the call today, just knowing to where you can pull out that paperwork, or in my case, I ended up, I believe, going to our pediatrician and having them print me out a copy. But most important, it is just to start making those connections and to have fun and to be able to kind of start to connect and visualize and just get more comfortable. I think that's probably the biggest goal, because if you're comfortable, you then don't mind asking questions and following up, and that's what we want students to feel free to do and encourage them to do. Asking for help is a really good thing. Here's a picture of the Orono campus. And so many of you have been on the Orono campus, and of course it is, I think, probably one of the largest campuses here in Maine. But you know, one of the things that's super important to do is to kind of get that sense of navigating the campus ahead of the first day of classes. And you can do this at orientation, or you can do it at another time. I transferred to Orono my sophomore year, and so I moved in with a roommate who I did not know, but she was a year older than me. And so she was already familiar with the campus, and she was there early working orientation, because they had just before classes started orientation as well. And so the day before classes started, she just took me around, and you know, I had my class schedule, and she showed me where all the buildings were, and that was just, again, so helpful and just put my mind at ease. Smaller campuses, it might not be quite as big a deal, but it's still a good idea to get that walk around campus and to be able to time things. So, you know, how long does it take to walk from the dorm to the classroom or to the union or wherever might be the case? Little things that can make a really big difference as students are making that transition. Another one is, if a student is living off campus, is to make sure they know where to park and how long it's going to take them to get to a parking space, how much trouble they might have finding a parking space, and how long it's going to take them to get to class. Not only did I go to Orono, but I worked at Orono for years, and I always had to remind myself that the first day of classes were going to be absolutely crazy. And you know, summer I'd gotten lulled into being able to find a parking space easily, you know, to be able to navigate the campus without too much, you know, traffic in terms of vehicles. And then the first day of classes, everything went out the window and everything took longer and everything was just a little bit harder. So students to get familiar with the pathway that they're taking, to know where they're headed, and then to build in that extra time, because it is always going to be crazy that first day of classes. The other thing I really want students to be aware of is that if they have any questions about any of these things, that people are there all summer long. Staff are there all summer long. Hopefully summer's a little bit quieter than the academic year, but you know, I know when I was working on a campus that we made sure that, you know, the office was always fully staffed. We staggered our summer vacations just so we could be sure that when students had questions, there was someone there to answer them. Another step in the process is for students to send in their final grades. So we have high school students. We want to be sure that their final high school transcript is sent in. You know, sometimes that seems like it happens automatically, but there are other times when it does not. So students need to be sure that they send in that final high school transcript, because in order to get financial aid, for example, you have to document that you graduated from high school. So that's really a key piece to make sure of that people don't always realize. You also want to make sure, if you have students who have taken AP classes and taken the AP test, which I think is right around this time of year, that depending on the score that they received, that is something that may allow them not to have to take a particular class because they scored high enough on their AP test. So communicating that information and providing that to the college is super important. And then, of course, if you have transfer students, sending in that final college transcript. My youngest son is transferring, and so he's finishing up classes this week. So like, that's one of the things on our to-do list, is to make sure that that final transcript from the school he's currently at gets sent to his new school. And then we've already talked a little bit about registering for classes, but understanding how registration works and when it's going to take place is really critical. You know, again, a class is going to be assigned, or at least some classes. Are they going to be automatically registered for those classes? Or is it going to take place during orientation? Or is there a special counseling session where that's going to take place? placement tests, as we talked about, and the impact of dual enrollment transfer classes or AP classes. So again, making sure that the school has all of that information so that the class schedule that is put together is one that is going to work for the student, both in terms of having the classes that they need, but also, as we talk about here, does the schedule actually work? So some students have other commitments that they want to be aware of, and so sometimes they might need to make a change to the schedule, even if it is automatically assigned. In other cases, they might just simply be people who know they're better in the morning. I was a little bit later in the day. 8 o'clock classes were the bane of my existence when I was in school. So whenever possible, I wanted to take a class that didn't start any earlier than 9. And I had I'm that person that late in the afternoon, I've still got a lot of energy. So I always try to work my schedule that way. So students just knowing themselves and what can work for them. Maybe some of them are also having to work some. So making a schedule that works for them to the best of their ability. Now, there are going to be sometimes you just have to take the class when it's offered. That's what it is. You got to work around it. But, trying to find that balance is really important. All right, now let's talk a little bit about the financial aid process and where students probably are in the process. I do want to talk a little bit about outside scholarships. For a matter of fact, I added a slide to this presentation that we didn't have previously. It's actually going to be the next slide. It was a little bit in the slide deck I sent you. It's a little bit later, but I moved it this morning. So I'm going to talk about outside scholarships in a moment. But one of the things that students need to do over the summer, if they haven't already, is if they are going to be borrowing any federal student loans at all, they need to complete their entrance counseling and sign a master promissory note. So these are both things that students need to do one time, especially if they're staying at the same school. They need to do the first time they are an enrolled college students, again, if they're planning on taking out federal direct loans. The way this works now is that students simply go online to the federal site and they walk through this counseling. The idea of the counseling is to make sure that students are aware of what a loan is, what the terms and conditions are, when they have to start repaying it, some of the flexibility even when they get done school, when it comes to the options they'll have about how their repayment is going to be structured, all of that sort of information. Now, students aren't going to memorize every bit of that information. But what I think happens with students is we need to be sure that at regular points throughout this process, they're getting information on loans. And so this is going to be one of the first steps in that process of making sure that they understand loans and how they work. So it's a requirement. They have to do it, but it's a really important thing that they do. And sometimes I think parents have done it for their students. We've definitely seen that happen. I have sometimes been a parent that's been a bit more engaged maybe than I should have as well. But the temptation is there. I get it. But it's really important that students understand this themselves. And then the master promissory note, basically the first time, again, the student borrows, they sign a master promissory note. I'm sorry about my cough. And that is going to cover them for 10 years. So basically they don't have to sign a new promissory note every single year. That note covers them for any borrowing they do for the 10 years that follow the signing of that note. Now, when I talk about signing, here is one of the challenges with this process. When I talk about signing a master promissory note or accessing really any of this federal student loan information, in order to do that, the student is going to need their FSA ID. So the FSA ID is that username and password that students created probably either just before they did their FAFSA, or they might have done it a little bit earlier than that, but many students did just as they were doing their FAFSA. And we really stress the importance of writing down that username and password, keeping it in a safe location because they're going to need it ongoingly. And this is one of the times that they need it. So it's a good idea to remind students to have that in a safe place. One of the things that we recommend, and the feds don't like it that we recommend this, but it's just the reality that students are going to need this. So if they can write it down and then take a picture of it and have it saved on their phone. Now, it's really critical that they have their phone locked. We don't want them, not locking their phone and having people have access to that. That's not a good idea at all. But they really want to have their phones locked and secured anyway. But then that way they have access to that information easily. FSA IDs are, for any of you out there who work with students regularly, it's the bane of our existence when it comes to the financial aid process. And one of the challenges is that the student can't just create a new FSA ID. It's tied to their social security number. So once they have one, they need to know what the username and password is, or they need to have a way of resetting passwords and rediscovering usernames. So we want to be sure that we make this as simple as possible. If any additional borrowing is required beyond federal student loans, which I would love to think it's not, we could do a whole session, and we do whole sessions on loans. You know, so I'll leave that, I'll put that aside for today. But if additional borrowing is required, this is the time to start thinking about that. You know, in June probably, some families certainly already have. So we want to be sure that they're getting prepared to actually pay their bill, and for many families, additional borrowing is required to make that happen. June's Wednesday webinar is actually tips for paying the tuition bill, so we will go into that in more detail, but it's a good time to start doing that research now. If the student is awarded work study, they're going to need to understand the next steps, the most significant piece of that being that they are going to need to find a job if they're wanting to use their work study. I think work study is an absolutely fabulous program. I really, really encourage students, if they have work study, to work and take advantage of work study programs. It's a great opportunity to connect with another set of people on campus. You know, one of the things that we find is that students who connect with someone early on tend to transition better. That person might be a roommate, that person might be a professor, and that person might be the person who's their supervisor in their job. So whoever that might be, doing work study just provides one other set of people to connect with. So it's really great if students can secure that job early on and make those connections. Most schools are going to send students automatically information about how to take advantage of work study, but if not, be sure that the student researches that so that they can line that job up. And then last but not least, when it comes to financial aid, is we want to be sure that the appropriate FERPA forms get filled out. And basically FERPA is kind of like HIPAA in the sense that information is protected and that students are the only ones typically that are eligible to have access to certain pieces of information, but whether it be financial or academic. But what is in place is the ability for students to sign a form that allows other individuals to have access to their information. I will be perfectly honest, one of the things I said to my boys, and I did not get any pushback on, but you know, I do have access to all of their information. So I have access to their financial aid. I can see the information in the portal. I can see their bill. I can see their grades. And so that's how we've done it for us. Some students have a different situation. Maybe they are okay with their parents having access to the financial aid information in the bill because they're hoping they're going to pay it. In other cases, though, they may not want them to have information related to their academics. So discussion to take place for all involved, but just know that especially once classes actually start, when you call the financial aid office as a parent, they are not going to talk to you about certain things. So it's really important that those forms get signed if there is going to be the need to have those sorts of discussions. Many parents will say to me, is it better if I've got questions about financial aid or my student has questions about financial aid, who should call? Should it be the student or the parent? And I think that ultimately we want students to be handling these pieces of information, but I'll be perfectly honest, especially over the summer, and especially where we're trying to figure out getting the bill paid, parents are typically, or oftentimes, not typically, but oftentimes are going to be involved. So I think that it's a joint effort. I think, you know, sometimes the student's going to pick up the phone and hand it over to their parents or vice versa. Everyone being on the same page is always going to be helpful. But again, once school starts, that ability for parents to call and get answers to questions will not exist unless those FERPA forms are signed. So contact the financial aid office, the admissions department, the registrar's office. Any of the people on campus can direct you towards where you can go to get those forms signed and finalized. So now I wanted to come back and talk about outside scholarships for a moment. And I did move this slide, so it was, I think, four slides later initially, but I moved it back to here. I wanted to talk in a little bit more detail about outside scholarships because we find we're getting a lot of questions recently about this. So what I want families to know and people who are working with families to know is that the student is required to let their school know if they're receiving any outside scholarships. So some students may be aware of scholarships already. Many of those scholarships are going to be awarded either at an academic night or at high school graduation. So once the student knows about that, it's really important that they let their school know as soon as possible. The reality is the school's going to find out anyway. And the reason the school's often going to find out is because typically, much of the time, the money is going to come in the form of a co-payable check to the student and the school. So when the money comes in to the business office in that form of a check, the business office is going to let the financial aid office know that. Sometimes that's going to be in the second semester. So many scholarships become available for January. Now the student needs to successfully complete that first semester, and then they can have that scholarship money. When schools don't find out about an outside scholarship until January, it's a much more difficult process because it's so much later in the year and there aren't the same options available. So for example, if a student is in a situation where they get an outside scholarship, they call the financial aid office, they let them know that. Many times that scholarship isn't going to have any impact on the other aid that they're receiving. Unfortunately, most schools are not able to fill all of a student's needs. So the student still has some need. That scholarship can just come in and it can fill need that wasn't filled, and they're all the better for it. So that's great, that's wonderful. However, sometimes adjustments are required. And so if an adjustment is required, many schools will do this automatically, but what the student wants to do is to contact their school and say, is an adjustment required? And if so, what has to be adjusted, or what are you going to adjust to start with? If adjustments are required, of course, we would like to have loans adjusted first or work study. So if a need-based loan, like a subsidized federal student loan, can be adjusted, that's a good thing, right? Because it means that the student is not going to owe as much when they leave school. So that's one of the first things, you know, my students in that situation, that's what I want to ask for. Or I might know that my student's not going to take advantage of that work study for a variety of reasons. They just are not feeling like they can work. Although I will say that students with work study do tend to do better academically. And one of the keys is that, you know, working a lot is detrimental to students' academics oftentimes, but there is a sweet spot there. And working about 12 to 15 hours a week actually has been shown to have a positive correlation with academics, and students who do that do tend to do better. But let's just say the student is like, nope, I just can't work that first semester. Well, then I'd rather have the work study reduced because they're not going to use that anyway. So let that be reduced, and there's really no impact of having that happen. So having that conversation is absolutely critical. The next thing is if adjustments are required and they're starting to get into a type of funding that the student's really not wanting to have adjusted, make sure that they're aware of the other expenses. So for example, the computer. Many students over the course of the summer are going to purchase a computer, you know, in order to take that to school with them. Not all students can afford to do that, but many will. And so the school is probably not recognizing that expense. They're not building that in up front like they do books, but they are allowed to. So if you go to a school and you say, hey, I just purchased a new computer, this is how much it costs me, sometimes what they can do is they can recognize that expense. So when a student has too much money, not that that happens all that often, it certainly doesn't feel like it happens to a student, but if an outside scholarship comes in and it requires this adjustment, there's two ways to fix it: reduce aid or increase the acknowledged expenses. So by letting them know that there are other expenses that they hopefully will acknowledge, that can also resolve this scenario where aid might be adjusted. So I just wanted to talk about that a little bit because I think sometimes there's the thought if we just say nothing, no one will ever know, but they will know. And when they don't find out until January, if a student has already worked those work study hours, obviously that can't be adjusted. If those loans have already been dispersed, you know, then there's another whole issue there, and they can't just, you know, reduce those loans. So that's why it's so important to just attack this, you know, say, hey, I got these scholarships. hopefully no impact at all. If there is an impact, hopefully it doesn't matter, you know, in the sense that the student's really good with having their loans or work study reduced, or if not, they can have some expenses increased so they get to keep all of those funds. If you ever have questions about any of this and want to talk more about it, please let me know. And so then we move on to actually talking about paying the bill. So that's another big point over the summer. You know, in the perfect world, I think that families hopefully have put together a plan before the student ever deposited at a school and made the decision to attend that school, but we find that is just not always the case. So what happens is the bill is going to be sent usually late June or early July. The bill is going to be sent in the form of a paper bill in some cases, but electronically in other cases. When I talk about things being communicated electronically or an email being sent, and this is the case with a bill, this is the case with a financial aid, what the school is going to do when they use the electronic process is they're simply going to send an email saying, hey, your bill is available or your financial aid is available. Typically in an email, that is never going to include the details because of privacy reasons and security. So what it's going to do is the email is just going to be an alert to go check the portal. And that's why a student becoming comfortable with their portal, knowing how to navigate the portal, knowing where to find that information is so critical, so that if the school is communicating electronically, they know exactly where to find that information. What we're seeing is that a lot of schools are definitely still sending paper to their first year students, but very quickly transitioning them to all electronic. And that's happening more quickly now than it ever has, because for all sorts of reasons, cost savings, stamps and paper are expensive, but also because it's just a lot more efficient. And students, to be honest with you, are way more comfortable with dealing with things electronically sometimes than the parents like me. The bill is usually going to be due about 4 to 6 weeks after the bill is received. So what you're looking at is probably late July, early to mid-August, depending on the school and when they're starting, and of course when they sent the bill. So it's really important that families just kind of have a plan to have that bill paid. We'll talk just a little bit more about that in a moment. And for example, if one of the things that the family is going to do, if they're going to pay some of the bill through, maybe they have some next gen savings, which is going to be a great way of maybe taking care of a portion of that bill. They just want to know that they want to start the process to withdraw the funds from a next gen account, for example, about 2 to 3 weeks ahead of when they actually need those funds. So, you know, just knowing when that bill is due and making sure that anything that needs to happen to get that money available or make that money available, that takes place. As far as paying the bill, I'd love to think that we have students out there who don't have a balance, you know, that their financial aid has covered everything. We don't tend to see that as much anymore. Certainly at the community colleges, which are much more affordable, there are definitely some cases where the bill is completely covered, and there might even be a credit that students can use for their books and supplies. But at many schools, there is still going to be a balance. So if there is a balance, the first thing you want to do is take a look and see what financial aid has been applied. So in looking at the financial aid award, whether it's online or on paper, and then looking at the bill, does everything show in both places? Sometimes loans don't show initially because loan funds cannot actually be applied to the account until just about the start of the semester. What many schools will do is will show the loans as an estimated award or an anticipated award. And so they're showing it, so it brings the balance down so you know exactly what is actually due. I've seen other cases, though, where until the loan funds actually arrive and are applied to the account, they are not showing up with the business office or the bursar's office at all. So if that's the case, you want to look at that remaining balance and say, okay, yes, but we know the student has a loan coming and the loan is going to be covering XYZ portion of that balance. So doing that comparison is critical. And then you need to figure out, of course, you know, how is the rest of that bill going to get paid? And like I said, when students are trying to decide whether or not they're going to attend a school, hopefully they've thought through that, they and their parents thought through that at the time, but we know in reality that doesn't always happen. So we're going to talk just for one more slide about paying the bill in just a moment. But exploring those options to figure out, you know, what works best. When you're looking at the bill, you will see that families, or excuse me, when you look big picture at who's paying the bill and how that bill is getting paid. I just threw in this chart because this is kind of interesting. We can see where scholarships and grants come into play. We can see, relatives and friends sometimes helping, student income and savings, parent income and savings, student borrowing, parent borrowing. So if you've ever wondered kind of how that breaks down, this is information from Sally May as to how families actually pay for college. So I just want to go into just a tad more detail about some of the options to pay the bill. And again, we've got a whole webinar on this next month. But thinking about the options, obviously one of the first things we talk about are savings. Do families have any savings? If parents have been able to save over the years, obviously that's a really good and positive thing. One of the things I always talk about is the fact that savings does not have a negative impact on financial aid eligibility for many, many, or even most families here in Maine. And for those where it does have some impact, the impact is so minor and insignificant that it really is not an issue typically when families understand how the financial aid formula works. But there is this myth sometimes that savings is a bad thing. So whenever I have the opportunity to talk about this, I just want to share that absolutely is a myth. I think what happens sometimes is some families have saved and then they find that they don't get as much financial aid as they thought they were going to receive. And they think it's because they've saved, when in reality, it wasn't because they saved. They just weren't going to get more financial aid. But having savings provides them with options. So I'll get off that for a moment. But savings, if families have it, can really be a good way of getting some of that balance paid, obviously. And for students, that's really important too. So through graduation, a lot of students are going to get some gifts from those around them, some monetary gifts. And so, I understand that students have just accomplished something amazing when they've graduated from high school, and to take some of that money and to do something really fun with it, or to buy their computer, or whatever might be the case, that's really wonderful. And I wish that students could just be able to just celebrate with all of that money in some ways, right? But what we see is that many students are, there's a little bit of a challenge getting that bill paid. So if that student can set aside some of that graduation money, maybe not to pay the bill specifically, but even to cover books and supplies, that will really do them a favor as they work through the summer and try to get that bill paid. And, that's a conversation I had with my kids. They weren't necessarily excited about it, but, we just really felt like, hey, moving on to the next step is going to really pay off. So to take some of that money and set that aside, that's really important. And to be honest with you, we just kind of said, it's what we need you to do. Outside scholarships, we've talked a little bit about that. One-time payments, so basically just taking that maybe, money that you've been setting aside and just paying the bill. I don't find many families are doing that. That's a really difficult thing to do. But tuition payment plans are something that families may want to investigate. And what a tuition payment plan is when you take your bill, and it can be any portion of your bill. So I think one of the things that sometimes when people look at tuition payment plans, they think if they go that route and select that option, they have to pay all of the remaining bill through a tuition payment plan, and that is just not the case. I've definitely taken advantage of tuition payment plans through the years, and so what I did, it was kind of the backwards way. I said, okay, what can we afford? So how much out of our family budget can we afford to do through a tuition payment plan? And that's how we came up with the amount. But a tuition payment plan is not a loan. There is no interest accruing. There is an enrollment fee. Usually it's pretty small, depends on the school, $30, $35, $40 are typical amounts. But it just allows families to spread payments out over a period of time, 4 or 5 months, oftentimes per semester. And it's kind of like with the orthodontist or the oil bill. It's not that it's still not the same amount of money, but spreading it out over a series of months can make it feel more affordable, more manageable, more doable. And then in some cases, families are needing to pursue additional loans above and beyond federal student loans, which we still believe are the best loans to borrow if students need to borrow. But if borrowing beyond that is necessary, we have a FAME Connected website called The Loan for Me. We are never at FAME going to tell you or tell your families what they should do or who they should borrow through. The purpose of the Loan for Me website is to compare lenders, provide information on what families need to be asking lenders what things might want to impact, who they decide to borrow through. For example, do they want to do a variable rate loan? Do they want to do a fixed rate loan? What might be the case? The Loan For Me has all sorts of great information there, and again, allows families to actually compare a variety of Maine-based loans if they need to go down that path. For me, many of you I've connected with over the past, and my big thing about paying for college is it's really a piecemeal approach. And so the idea of whether it be the tuition payment plan or whatever might be the case, whenever you can have more pieces to that pie, no one piece needs to be as large as we might have thought it had to be. And so sometimes, I think there can be this feeling of, oh, well, this is just a small amount, a couple $100 here, a couple $100 there. It doesn't really have an impact because college can be so expensive in some cases, but every little bit matters. And all the more pieces you have in that pie, the more effectively you're going to find paying for college is going to be, or a little bit easier. And so even having a conversation, which again did with my kids, about their summer earnings, what's going to happen with those summer earnings? Where are those funds going to go? And I want them to be able to have some fun, but having that conversation. So just have as many pieces to that pie as possible. All right. So just a few more things to go through. We want to talk about housing. We want to be sure that students get their room and board forms all completed, that they pay their housing deposit. We also want to be sure that they, as we talked about a little bit ago, they provide all of their immunization forms. Students literally cannot start classes in some cases without having certain immunizations in place or the appropriate paperwork to document whatever's needing to be documented. So really important to get on that one early and not have a last minute surprise about that piece. When it comes to health insurance, so for a while, everyone was, well, I guess we're all still required to have health insurance. I think it's just that we don't get a penalty if we don't have health insurance. What schools started doing when this occurred, which was part of the ACA, is schools started offering health insurance to students. And they had, for years, I think, had the option of health insurance. But many schools just now automatically assume a student needs health insurance and puts the cost of the purchase of health insurance automatically on the student's bill. Now, I've seen a few schools that are no longer doing this, but I think the vast majority are. Now, the other thing that was in the ACA is, of course, that we can keep our kids on our health insurance if we're able to until the age of 26. So many times the student does already have health insurance, so they don't need the college's health insurance. But there is a process that you have to go through to get that waived. So in the case of my oldest son, what we had to do is I had to go online into his student portal, and I had to literally type in who our insurance carrier was and what our policy number was. And once I did that, and then officially waived the insurance, and then once we did that, then that charge came off the bill. But I can't tell you how many times over the last several years I've had parents who had worked through what they thought the bill was going to look like for the fall, and then they get a bill that's maybe $1,200 or $1,500 more than they expected, and they just about lose it. And what it is in reality is it's that health insurance. So they can go ahead and they can waive that, and then it will come off. But just expect that that probably is going to be on the bill, and just know that you've got to go through a process to waive it and get it off the bill. And there's usually a deadline associated with that. So I'm thinking at my oldest son's school, I think it was like mid-September. We wanted to get it off as soon as possible. And we had to do that every single year. So again, questions about that, reach out to the school directly. General questions, always feel free to ask me, and I'll share what I'm aware of there. And then parking permits. Sometimes students will be living off campus, so they're going to need a parking permit, or even they're going to be living on campus and they want to be able to bring a car to campus. I am one of those people who think if you can get by without a car on campus, that's a really, really, really good thing. It snows in the Northeast, cars have to be moved. The tickets cost a lot. It's tempting to park where you shouldn't. One time my sister cashed in her her board plan in order to pay all of her parking tickets, so she didn't have to tell my mother why she couldn't register for classes. So parking on campus can be a challenge. So if it can be avoided, that's a really good thing. And then purchasing books. So when it comes to purchasing books, there are so many more options available than in the past. One of the great things that exists now is that students are actually able to see what books they need as soon as they register for classes. So there's now a requirement that if you register for once you've registered for your classes, that they're supposed to show you what books are required. So that might seem like a little thing, and I'm dating myself now, but back in the day, we had to take our class schedule over to the bookstore and stand in line and go through the stacks to figure out what books were required for what classes, and it's just a totally different world now. So they can see what classes, what books are required for individual classes, and then they can go ahead and purchase them. Now, I've had mixed opinions on this. I tend to be of the camp that having your books the first day of classes is really good, and I probably in the past had even said really necessary to get off on a good foot. That being said, I've had other people come back to me and push back a bit and say, you know what, Mila, though, until you go to class, you're not always really sure which books are really needed. You know, even if they say required, maybe they're really not, or maybe you can share with someone. So I've had other people who say, you know what, sometimes going to that first class first is a good idea. I'm going to be honest, I still am leaning towards, I think it's a good idea to get your books ahead of time and have them all ready to go, so that you can start right away with your assignments and, you know, feel like you're prepared. But talk with, you know, your students, have them talk with people at the school, get a sense of how they recommend that go. When you do purchase books, one of the important things to do is to be sure that you know what all of your options are, because again, very different now. So you can purchase actual books. If you can, I always recommend purchasing used books, as long as they're the right edition number. So there's that ISBN number. Make sure it's the right edition of a book. But used books, hey, sometimes they're already highlighted for you, which can be even better, as long as the person highlighting it previously was picking out the right stuff. But used books, in all seriousness, are often almost looking like new in many cases, and are much, much more affordable. Students can now rent books, so especially if it's a book that you aren't interested in keeping for the long run, maybe you just rent it for the semester. You can do digital downloads. My oldest son loves this. Like, he is just such a different kid than I was as a student, and he just wants to be able to look at everything on his computer. I still like a book in my hand, but he loves digital books, and you can do searches, you know, easier and stuff. So for many students, that's going to work really well. And then, of course, there are going to be some cases where those free resources are also available in other means. So I think the big thing is the student needs to know what books they need. They need to have a plan to purchase their books. So one of the pieces here is that sometimes students are relying on their financial aid refund to cover the cost of their books. The problem is that depending on the school, that refund might not be available for a little bit into the semester. And, you know, there might be some disagreement about whether you need books the first day of classes, but you certainly, even if you don't need them the first day, you need them really early. So you got to have a plan to figure out how to purchase your books. You know, one of the best, if students can do it, recognizing that some students are working over the summer to pay a lot of different expenses, maybe even family expenses. But if a student over the summer can set aside some of their earnings, or if they can set aside, again, some of that graduation money if they get some, so that they have the money to cover those books when they are ready to purchase them. I think that is a really good thing. I like the idea of starting with the bookstore on campus and just seeing what's available, seeing the cost, and then doing some research and going to some of these other sites and seeing where the best deal is. Sometimes the best deal is with the bookstore, and sometimes the best deal is at one of these other locations. You want to be sure that you coordinate your living space. You know, what are you going to need in your room? One of the first things to do is to determine what is already provided. When my son went to USM, actually, his first year, he found that they already had a microwave and fridge already supplied in the room. So that was awesome. Finding out what stuff is not allowed, hot plates, toaster ovens, things like that. So if you're planning to bring something and you don't want to get there and realize you're not allowed to have it, you want to know, you know, basically what you and your roommate are both bringing, so you can coordinate that space, because it is a small space. So you don't need 2 TVs or 2 this or 2 that typically. So having that conversation and getting to know your roommate and coordinating that is really important. All right, so Two more things. One of which is, these are both resources, the checklist. So I sent to everyone who is registered by whatever time I sent it yesterday, a copy of this checklist. So this is a checklist that we put together at FAME that is really meant to be kind of an overarching list of things that need to get done. It is not school specific, so it may vary depending on the individual school, but these are pretty common things that students need to follow up on. So I did include that with the email yesterday, but it can be found on our website, and I put the full link there. We would love to have you share this with your students. So for school counselors out there, if you can, print off copies or, electronically share a copy of this with all of your seniors, just to make sure that they are aware of all of these things that need to be done. It's a little overwhelming, but these are the things that need to be done. We think that would be great. I know some schools, when they're having the students get ready for graduation, they're standing in line, trying to get them organized. They're checking with them about plans and things like that. Having these available and saying, hey, here's a checklist, just make sure you've got to do all of these things over summer, that could be really helpful, I think. So please use this in whatever way is beneficial to you. And if you need adjustments to it, if you see something, you say, hey, Miley, you got this wrong, you need to add this, take this off, alter this, please let us know. We're always open to that and looking for feedback. And then new this year, we have a short animated video, and I will include the link to this when I send out the follow-up email, but you can see where the link is right there at the bottom of the page. So we do a series of animated videos. They're usually about 5 minutes or less long. They're meant to be very short and just very high level. But we did one just recently on transitioning to college, and so we would love to have you check this out yourself, share it with your students, just a quick, hopefully much more user-friendly way for students to get information on this process. As I mentioned previously, the June Wednesday webinar is going to be on understanding the bill and tips to get it paid. We'd love to have you register. I'm having a brain cramp because I hope I updated the registration link, but we will send out, if it's not the right one, we will be sending out the registration. We do that usually 2 weeks before the webinar. It's also available on our website to register now, and that link, I'm positive, is up to date. And all of the Wednesday webinars are recorded and can be found on our K-12 and higher ed professionals page, and I will send you out an email to follow up and let you know that this has been recorded and where you can find it and provide that direct link. So if you want to listen again, or if you want to share it with colleagues or families, we would love to have you do that. So bottom line is just making sure that students are reading everything, which is overwhelming sometimes, but staying organized, and most important are asking questions. My youngest son is so resistant to ask questions, and I just keep telling him how important it is to do that. And that's what makes you smart. It's smart to ask questions. It's not that you're, saying, oh, I don't know something. First of all, yeah, even if you don't know, that's okay, but asking questions is smart, and one of the most significant skills I think that students need to learn, hopefully by the time they're going to college, but certainly as they start with college. So I have that it's about 2 minutes before 11, so I talked a lot, and it's always bizarre, you guys, when you're doing these webinars, and you're talking to yourself in a hotel room, and you can't see anyone. Okay. I am just trying to see if there are questions that I can quickly answer. And again, if they're not questions I can answer, I will be sure to send them. So I did have a question about the PowerPoint. So I did send the PDF, but, oh, never mind, you got it. If for any reason you ever want the actual PowerPoint, I usually send PDFs, not the actual PowerPoint, and I thought maybe this was going where it was going. But if you ever need the actual PowerPoint because you want to use slides from it, and that's just easier, you can do that. Just send me something, and I'm happy to send that. I've got a question about FERPA, and it says, under no circumstances will the university release any medical information. You'd have to follow up with the school to find out, if there's a medical emergency, what happens. But FERPA is not dealing with anything medical. So I know there's a whole other set of rules related to medical circumstances. So I would want you to be sure that you follow up with the school and have an understanding of how they deal with medical issues. Not seeing any other questions at the moment, but feel free to always send them to me personally, mtappen@FameMaine anytime. And you are going to get a survey, and I would love to have you respond to that survey and let me know if this was helpful today. If I talked too much, if I didn't talk enough about certain things, whatever might be the case, and have the opportunity to let us know what future topics you would like to see. Okay, so I think we're going to call it a day for the purposes of today's webinar. I hope that you all have a great day. It looks like it's beautiful outside, and thank you so much. And just please know that as your students transition through this process, whether they're your kids personally or whether they're students that you're working with, we're here all summer long at FAME and want to help in any way that we possibly can. So take good care, and I look forward to connecting with many of you in the coming weeks and months. Bye-bye.